Everybody, and welcome to today's colloquium. Professor Gates is unable to be here. He is undergoing a medical procedure, but he'll be back soon. And I have an announcement to make before we start. So do come to next week's colloquium, which will be delivered by our NAS fellow, Tef Poe. He'll be speaking on Universe of Insanity, Culture Shock, and the Black American Experience. Now, please welcome to the podium Nikki Green. She is Professor of Art at Wellesley College and a beloved alumna fellow.
Thank you so much. I miss this place desperately. Enjoy every hour that you're here. I have the great privilege of introducing Kurt Campbell. Kurt Campbell is an artist and senior lecturer in new media at the University of Cape Town. He holds a BFA and a PGCE from the University of Cape Town and a master's degree from Stellenbosch University, where he taught for 4 years before joining the Michaelis School of Fine Art. His PhD was completed at the Center for Humanities Research at the University of Western Cape. Kurt's recent artworks combine sculpture and augmented reality to facilitate interactive art experiences. The conceptual frameworks of his visual research often engage the post-apartheid, post-colonial space of aesthetic ideation in South Africa. Recent exhibitions that reflect these creative and conceptual concerns include Night Fighter in 2014 and Boxing Ghosts in 2015 at the District 6 Museum. And I thought it was important to mention that he is an active artist because as an art historian, I'm always interested in those who can do both, create things and write about them quite well. Kurt's current monograph project here at the Hutchins Center for the Year recuperates the narrative of Andrew Jeptha, a Cape Town-born boxer who was the first Black fighter to win a British welterweight title in 1907. As a result of that victory, Jeptha was permanently blinded and took to preparing a book titled A South African Boxer in Britain in 1910. I don't want to give away too much of his talk for today, but I will say that part of Kurt's aims is that he hopes that through his monograph, he will support the intellectual voices that he encounters with the Hutchins Center this year by showing how the interplay of boxing, care of the self, sophisticated writing, and crucially loving across color lines may be constitutive of how it is we overcome the psychic and social nightmare of racial formations so desperately needed in South Africa. So without further ado, please welcome Kurt Campbell.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nikki. Can you guys hear okay? Sure. In what only may be acknowledged as an incredible honor and privilege, I find myself as the Hutchins Mandela Fellow for Fall 2017, along with my colleague, Dr. Musa Couper from the University of Cape Town. So before I start, please allow me to thank a number of people who have made this incredible journey possible. Thank you to Krishna Lewis, Abby Wolf, Skip Gates, Sandra Mancebo, and Valma DuPont from the Hutchins Center. It's been the most incredible time simply because of the generosity these individuals have shown me. I also want to thank my wife, Nikita Lynette Campbell, my parents, Lionel and Claudette Campbell, and my mother-in-law, Leslie Stober, who's ensured that I have absolutely no domestic worries and I can and I can focus on my work at the Hutchins Center. What I must say also is to acknowledge my academic mentors, Professor Pramesh Lalu, Professor Martinez Ruiz, and Professor Jane Alexander, who are very much part of my intellectual universe at the moment, and I'm sure will continue to be so in the future. And also to say almost immediately that, you know, in a room like this, filled as it is with such incredible scholars that I've come to know over the last few weeks, you know, language may fail me. So please be patient as you decipher what I hope will be sort of coherent mumblings. So Andrew Jeptha was in fact the first black fighter to win a formal British title. And he achieved this feat in 1907 in a crowded hall that was called Wonderland, a regular venue for fighting, when he delivered an incredible right uppercut to the chin of Curly Watson, who he had met on 2 previous occasions to become the welterweight champion of Britain. And Andrew Jeptha's life, I think in many ways, reads with such drama. I don't think that a Hollywood producer could have scripted his life better if he was making a movie. At the tender age of 17, Andrew Jeptha wins the welterweight title in South Africa on his very first attempt without any formal training. And this speaks volumes about his capacity as a fighter. But he was also a very complicated figure. He spoke about the idea of boxing in some ways being a therapy for him, a way that he managed to quell the anger inside of him that he experienced after the early death of his mother. And Andrew Jeptha also spoke about the idea of seeing himself as a boxer who was also a bit of a scientist, somebody who wasn't simply a brute, but somebody who thought quite carefully about how he would conduct himself in the fistic ring. What we can also say beyond Andrew Jeptha's incredible skill as a fighter was that we know with great certainty that he was a highly, highly educated citizen, in the sense that there was a special monastic group called the Little Brothers of Mary, or the Maritz Brothers, that came from France with a mission to educate young men, but with a special focus on reading and writing. And Andrew Jeptha could count himself as one of the first students in their class who was trained to an exquisitely high level of reading and writing. So it's not as if Andrew Jeptha had a lack of options in terms of what he could become. So often boxers are portrayed as people that have limited options. And here was somebody who was trained right up till 16 as a black subject, which was quite unusual at the time. And what's also important for us to realize is that with whatever frame we choose to think about Andrew Jeptha, whether it's psychologically, using anthropology with a historical frame, I think what comes out very strongly is the idea of how we look at Andrew Jeptha in relation to racial formations. Racial formations not only in the past, but I would also argue racial formations we're seeing both in the USA, as I've seen in the last few weeks, and also in South Africa. And what's so intriguing about Andrew Jeptha is that he's in South Africa at the time when South Africa moves from being a colony of Britain to a union, and ultimately the slide into what would become the nightmare of apartheid a few years after he dies, when South Africa becomes a republic. And what that shows us is that Andrew Jeptha himself wrote about the puzzle that he experienced when people spoke about him with a variety of different descriptors. So in London, he was known as the young black man. In France, he was known as Le Nègre. Quite surprisingly, in Ireland, he was known as the Boer, or the Afrikaans man. So Andrew Jeptha himself was acutely aware of how people were reading him in terms of race. Regardless of how people saw him, we know with great certainty that he was absolutely irresistible to a young Abby Mitchell, who was a young lass from Liverpool, and within 3 weeks of meeting her, they eloped. And he must have been a very charismatic person for this young lass to leave the familiar surroundings of her parents' home and their business to marry this stranger. And I would even argue he was more charismatic than our own Skip Gates. And eventually, Andrew Jeptha and his young bride are invited back to the family business and the family home. And Abby Mitchell births 3 children to Andrew Jeptha. And it must be said right up front that even though I'll be talking a lot about Andrew Jeptha, the boxer, there's a strong commitment that he displays to his family. I think the most heart-wrenching commitment is that after he's blinded in the very fight that gave him the title of the welterweight champion in 1907, he continues to fight, keeping his blindness a secret. And he was so good at fighting that it was quite a while before a referee stops the match that he was involved in and publicly declares, "This man is blind." So that speaks about his tenacity in wanting to earn for his family and not shame his wife, who had then married a black man. What is also telling is that the book you see here was also a special attempt to earn money for his family and send it back to London when he came to Cape Town to visit the Somerset Eye Hospital, that at that stage was seen as the leading hospital that could repair blind and damaged eyes. Unfortunately, Cape Town medicine, especially with a focus on eye care, was in its infancy, and they placed leeches on his eyes to draw out the blood, and this just complicated his whole vision to such an extent that he could not see a single thing. And he spoke to his wife, and they decided to produce a book that he would sell in Cape Town's Main Street in the hope of sending money back to his family. And tragically, this was at 35 years old, and he died at 40, and he never returns to Abbey Mitchell and his two sons. Charles, his oldest son, comes with him to Cape Town, and through a combination of diary entries, articles that he collected over the years of his travels and his fights, his oldest son transcribes the book for him. Now, you can't really be at Hutchins without thinking about the connection between Africa and America, and this is especially true in the realm of boxing. So the concomitant question that I think I will also offer is that there is a way where boxing is an intellectual bond, not simply a sporting bond or physical culture bond, that is evident in my research on my monograph through generations. And of course, the question which I hope to engage with you later is how we use this potential understanding in our production of knowledge, and specifically social knowledge. So for those of you that are uninitiated to the sport, so Andrew Jeptha is the boxer on the left. And what's so incredible is that Andrew Jeptha and Jack Johnson met each other in London at the time when they were both being racially transgressive by marrying white women, and they both reflected on each other as being talented boxers, and even working together, which I'll talk about a bit later, in a commercial venture. And we know that Jack Johnson and Joe Louis knew each other, that Jack Johnson himself was potentially, almost became the lead trainer for Joe Louis in his fight with Max Schmeling, even though it never materialized. And then the loop continues and returns to South Africa when Nelson Mandela talks in many different ways about what the inspiration Joe Louis was as an African-American fighter to his own imaginings of leadership and physical culture. And I think a very telling story is when Nelson Mandela speaks about listening to the radio, listening to fights that involve Joe Louis, and then ultimately receiving a ticket stub, an unused ticket stub from the Clinton administration that apparently reduced him to tears, a boxing stub of a Joe Louis fight, and apparently that was followed by Mandela jumping up and down like a young child. So there's a very powerful way that boxers are trained not only in the current moment, but they're trained to have an expansive view, because boxing is a very different sport to team sports. It's always about the individual to a large extent. And I think in writing up the monograph, it's been very important for me to try and think about how we use this knowledge production, how was it used in the past in terms of political generations. And I think as much as we try to be objective as academics, all journeys really start at home. And if I'm honest, in terms of the intimacy that I have with the fellows, a lot of my research was really piqued by my grandfather, Albert Campbell, on your right. And what's so interesting about Albert Campbell, as my father would recount in terms of the stories, was that the whole early Campbell clan were subject to forcible removal when they were moved from quite a pristine part of Cape Town and shoved into what was then a desolate township of Bridgetown. You can see that in the background. And the social kind of crisis that happens is that suddenly you don't know your neighbor on your left or your right. And what happens is that you have an opportunity to make yourself again in a new environment. And the Campbell men decided that physical culture was going to be a way to both show through a visible form that they were both to be respected because of the discipline it took to get themselves to a level where they could fight or weightlift, but also that they were to be respected and feared. And for me, what is intriguing, taking a scholarly view of this, is that at the height of apartheid, you have subjects that combine sort of musculature and ambition to create a work of the self, an internal work that has a visible outcome, to such an extent that Albert Campbell was no longer known as, then using apartheid terminology, a colored man or, a colored boxer, weightlifter, but he was known as Tarzan. There was an ontological shift, beyond the racial categories that developed. And I came across the idea of the muscular dream, right? Where people that are subject to an incredible amount of subjugation take a recourse to their bodies, right? And build a muscularity that helps them defy certain racial categories. And this idea of the muscular dream I found very productive, only to find that Fanon also wrote about the muscular dream. And even though Fanon was writing in a very different context, I just thought I would share something that has been very instructive with me from Fanon's text in relation to the muscular dream formulation. The first thing which the colonized learns is to stay in his place. This is why the dreams of the colonized are always of muscular prowess. His dreams are of action, of aggression. I dream I'm jumping, swimming, running, climbing. I dream that I burst out laughing, that I span a river in one stride, or that I'm followed by a flood of motor cars which can never catch up with me. So there's something incredibly physical that is wrought from social subjection in my formulation. So it would be useful to ask what socio-legal limits visited Andrew Jeptha, and in South Africa and also abroad. And again, Andrew Jeptha is what we could call a spectacular subaltern. He was an anomaly. He seems to have almost escaped many of the administrative barriers that were set for him. So in terms of his education, because of the mission of the Little Brothers of Mary, he was educated beyond and above what many black subjects were entitled and allowed to reach. He was incredibly mobile, visiting Wales, France, Ireland, London, and also his marriage to Abby Mitchell also seemed to flout a lot of what he experienced when he finally returned to Cape Town. But for the historians like Miles, a couple of dates. It's very intriguing to read the bureaucratic path that happens as South Africa goes from a colony to a union. As early as 1903, there are already laws policing interracial sex. In 1910, when South Africa eventually attains union status, it takes no more than 13 years for boxing actually to predate the Immorality Acts. What's so fascinating about reading the placing of boxing under racial control is that many commentators say they're more worried about women that may be watching interracial fights because it would elicit all kinds of desires in them that would end up disrupting the family unit, right? So as much as it was about men watching other men fight, there was a real fear for the psychological impact that this would have on women. And then, of course, the famous Immorality Act that prevented interracial marriage and that was punishable with heavy fines or imprisonment. But of course, in boxing, in Cape Town, we also find this idea of flouting the law. And what you see here is an incredible poster from the District 6 Museum, and I'm very grateful to Chris from the District 6 Museum and Tina, who gave me access. You see a Jewish fighter, a heavyweight champion, facing a black Caribbean fighter for the princely sum of 100 pounds. Now, in today's dollar exchange, I think it's about 8,000 US dollars. It may not be enough to entice somebody like Floyd Mayweather to fight, but it certainly was a substantial amount of money. And what's so interesting is that there are a number of these fights that occurred despite the racial hardening in South Africa because of the spectacle that it offered on a number of levels. So we know the most, sort of the big money fights always involved interracial fighting. And it was also an opportunity for the common man to also engage in a kind of strange sort of biological investigation, looking at difference, physiological difference between heavyweight fighters that are white and heavyweight fighters that are black, and making all kinds of wild conclusions at the end of these matches, talking with great excitement. And I think it's interesting to keep that in mind. In terms of the history of Cape Town, we know that race was always stalking boxing, in the sense that the earliest records of a big money fight, in inverted commas, involved a grudge match between Joe Coverwell, who was described as a Malay/mulatto fighter, and James Couper. And this is an image of James Couper, who is known as the father of boxing in Cape Town because he brought the Queensberry rules and established the gymnasium in Cape Town. And what's so fascinating about James Couper was that he wasn't necessarily a man that enjoyed engaging in sort of racial discourse, but it was his students that ultimately forced him to take a trip to Kimberley and face down this mulatto/Malay fighter, as they described him. And what that reveals was just how fragile the masculinities of his students were, because Joe Coverwell was enjoying a lot of interracial attention from women. So in 1883, Coverwell and Couper meet through a letter, and the students talk about the fact that Professor Couper should come and teach the boy manners because white women love him too fondly. And so the sad thing is, in a pattern that is repeated many years later, Couper is such a good fighter that he blinds Joe Coverwell and takes his water wagon and all of his possessions. And this is unfortunately something which we see repeated in Andrew Jeptha's life in terms of the damage of boxing and the interracial challenges he faced. Now, as much as we think, that when it comes to boxing, words are quite poor things, we must be so grateful for the texts that record boxes, even when the texts are very painful to read, as in the case with Joe Coverwell and Couper that I've just described now. And I often find myself wondering how many boxing matches that were incredible in terms of the technical innovation and the consequences of matches occurred that we never will know about because they were not really documented. And now returning to the talk, that's why Jeptha is such an incredible subject to study, in many ways a gold standard for historians or anthropologists, because not only was he a boxer, but he was a boxer who could write exceptionally well. And I even argue that he developed a new kind of writing, with his book being the first book on boxing, let alone one of the first biographical books from a black subject in South Africa. And what I'm going to ask you to hold in your mind during this talk is the idea that to write as a boxer, in terms of Andrew Jeptha's innovative use of text and his career as a boxer, combining the two, is that Jeptha's textual offering asks us a number of questions, but foregrounds the idea of boxing as a practice of care, not simply the violence between two men. Jeptha, as you will find when I read extracts from his book, negotiates blindness not as the summative verdict of disability, but in some ways it's almost a glorious wound. He talks about his boxing as a consequence of fighting at the highest possible levels of the sport. He talks about it as something that authorizes him to teach young men about boxing, which I think is quite important for us to hold on to in terms of understanding disability studies in the early 1900s. And Jeptha also acknowledges his blindness, but he keeps it in its place. So he allows a very broad possibility of being both a teacher and a mentor to those who come to read his book, not simply pity him. Now, this is very important for me, as I said, in the current situation in South Africa, and even what I'm watching with incredible shock in terms of what's going on in America, is that Jeptha at almost every turn talks about boxing as being very importantly invested in a community of care. He talks about the idea of boxers not actually being solitary fighters, but that it was so necessary to have a community that would offer support, from dietary requirements right down to people that would go with you into the ring. And Jeptha never mentions race as a barrier, He always talks about how gentlemen could find each other through an agreed system of manners. And I really think it's important to understand that Jeptha based most of his tutelage on understanding how important interracial relationships are, but more importantly, how the idea of being civil and being very kind and filled with manners would get the boxer as far as his physical prowess would get him. And to honor Jeptha, I could not but read one paragraph from his book and put that into your minds as a possibility that may validate my statement. So this is Andrew Jeptha writing. For my part, I would say, be very, very cautious with whom you make acquaintance, and thoroughly assure yourself that the man is perfectly upright and on the square in all his dealings before you admit him into intimate friendship. Don't mistake me. Don't show yourself suspicious of all men. That is the very worst form and the shortest way to getting yourself generally disliked. Be civil and obliging to all, but at the same time, I repeat, very careful in your conduct and your associates. Remember, a man is known by the company that he keeps. You will have a trying time of it in wearily conducting yourself. There are a number of so-called hangers-on at every sporting resort, and to these last you must go if you would improve yourself. But remember, undesirables abound, and many a fellow who seems a know-a-lot turns out to be a good-for-nothing. Be good-natured and wholeheartedly interested in yourself. Never make yourself too cheap. Show self-respect quite apart from any people you may encounter. And in short, be civil, obliging, and a cautious young fellow. So as much as Andrew Jeptha talks about boxing, these thoughts are almost immediately matched with an idea of care of yourself, care of the other, and we'll get into the deeper understandings of care of the self in terms of the Greco-Roman tradition and what Foucault writes about. Another paragraph, which I felt very important to read so that you get a taste for Jeptha's writing in the event you never go to Cape Town and actually read the book yourself. There's only one remaining copy in existence. Jeptha is also very aware that he wants to be seen as a strategist. And what I'm going to read you now is, in fact, the amazing last few minutes of the match that granted Andrew Jeptha the title of welterweight champion. And it's also instructive for me that so many people think Muhammad Ali, created a strategy which I think Americans refer to as rope-a-dope, where you just stay in the corner and you take punishment and then you release the punishment and in the last few minutes attack your opponent. So Andrew Jeptha, to put this in context, takes a beating for about 11 rounds before this paragraph is written, which he describes, taking severe blows to his eyes and to his head and to his ribs. But this was a carefully designed strategy, as he speaks about, and I'll read you the last few minutes of his fight. My second, Jim Stiles, white man, asked me how I felt. I replied, "Good, I think I can start my plan now." To which he agreed, advising me to start at once. Directly as the gong sounded, I jumped out of my chair and met Watson very nearly in his own corner. Instead of smothering up and covering, as I had been doing throughout the previous rounds, I struck him with all my might, landing a straight left-hand punch in the pit of his stomach. Directly I felt I had landed. I saw Watson's head drop, and then I stepped in and uppercut as hard as I could on his chin. Poor Watson fell as if he had been shot. I saw some of my supporters elated. The referee was counting the 10 seconds, and it seemed to me as if it was 10 years. I stood gazing at Watson's prostrate form, hoping he would not get up in time. Well, the referee said, "Out." I jumped to him and lifted him up. As you may imagine, I was overjoyed that I had beaten him, and so decisively at that, and that my plan had worked out all right. My supporters were elated. So again, a strategic fighter, a fighter that wants you to know he goes in there with a plan, he doesn't fight on instinct. And the last text that I want to read, and again, as a generosity to Jeptha, so that you can understand his own textual brilliance, is the idea of the glorious wound, which I mentioned at the start of my talk. The idea that Jeptha's blindness enables him rather than limits him in a certain special way when talking to other boxers. And this is at the introduction of his text. He's writing to young boxers who may buy the book. It will be manifest to you that I have seen a good deal of the United Kingdom of Great Britain. I have boxed north and south, east and west. As one who is South African born and bred, and who naturally takes an absorbing interest in the doings of South Africans in everything, particularly in sport, and more particularly in that section of it devoted to boxing, you may very rightly ask that I should pen a few words of advice, the outcome of my own experience, to those of the rising generation of boxers who have yet to experience the mill of the English boxing career. I do so with more pleasure that I am convinced my own native land, South Africa, is quite capable of producing excellent material, which with management, advice, and training will develop into men who may fairly claim to be in the first flight of boxers. But please, I pray you, take all I say as meant in the kindest manner, the outcome of my own bitter, varied experience, which may be useful to you all. And of course, before this paragraph, he talks about the blindness, but asserting it in no uncertain terms, that his own experience is there to assist boxers in a generous way. What's intriguing in his meeting with Jack Johnson before he becomes blind, as I mentioned before, was that at a certain point they were both married, which created certain racial transgressions. But also, if you're a scholar of Jack Johnson, you also know there's the idea of the gentleman boxer, and that they certainly met, not in the ring, but through a social code which they like to impress on the public through their suits, through their conduct outside of the ring. And I think that's very intriguing. What I argue may be as intriguing is an early poster which we find in Gravenstein's book. It talks about Jack Johnson and Andrew Jeptha appearing at the same venue, the Theatre of Varieties in Greenock. And what's so intriguing for scholars of literature, comparative literature, is that here you've got an incredible situation, and the text is really faded with time, but the idea that Jack Johnson and Tommy Burns don't actually fight at the venue, but rather the film of Jack Johnson fighting Tommy Burns is projected on a screen, which would allow punters to get excited and to actually watch a black man defeating a white man. After that, they could then spar with a real live black man, Andrew Jeptha, for a number of shillings to literally see how far they could get after seeing the filmic representation of a black man. And so we have this idea that Andrew Jeptha and Jack Johnson were actually used as a unit of measure in some form that was actually quite lucrative. Now, the incredible thing about boxing is that there are some studies that show we actually get changes in the chemistry of our brain when we watch boxing matches, and also when we see a great deal of physicality, because it's a very primal thing. So there are a series of 3 videos, very short, which I'm going to show you, to number 1, enforce that change in your brain, and number 2, to show you what we're dealing with. It's easy to talk to fighters through text, but when film matures at a certain point, we actually have the privilege of seeing these fighters in the flesh. And what was interesting is that fighters like Jack Johnson would tour and show off his muscular prowess in order to get backers. And what you're going to see now is Jack Johnson at the pinnacle of his career, a film that was shown throughout the world, including South Africa, being watched by Australian gentlemen to gauge whether or not they would bet for him or against him. And there's also a wonderful moment where he invites a fighter to try and wrestle him to the ground while he keeps his hands behind his back. So let me just, I'll just play that for you for a few minutes so you can see what we're dealing with here. And the famous fight, of course, that was actually the first movie banned in South Africa was the Jeffries-Johnson fight in 1910. And for those of you that are not initiated in fight culture, it was regarded as the biggest match of its day. More than 50,000 people. A special stadium had to be built because this was for the heavyweight title of America. And what you had was so many racist white citizens, Jim Crow era citizens saying, there's no way that the epitome of masculinity, which was then the heavyweight title of boxing, could be owned by a black man because of the symbolic power that that had. And Johnson literally kept chasing Jeffries for a shot at the title, and eventually got his shot. And it's so incredible to understand, many commentators, largely from America, talking about the dangers of him celebrating, not if, but when he knocked Jeffries out, because he could be lynched. There was no black people allowed in the stadium. And this was the first, as I said, fight to be banned in South Africa, also because of what many governors feared could be the psychological implications of black subjects seeing a white man being beaten so soundly. And that's actually the court order from Cape Town, 1910, asking all movie posters, films, not to be shown as a matter for the Secretary of Justice to enforce. And when we talk about this symbolic power, it's not a fantasy. We know that in the States, this was an actual statewide wire that was sent to a number of governors. Race riots and murder in many places following the announcement of Johnson's victory. These results will be multiplied manifold by moving picture exhibitions, join in recommending prohibition, save our children. And 24 citizens were actually killed in the days that followed the victory for various racially motivated reasons that were ignited by the Johnson victory. The last clip I'm going to show you with Jack Johnson, and the reason a lot of governors said it should be banned in South Africa, even though we know that Andrew Jeptha saw the previous fight in Cape Town, was the extreme confidence that Johnson displayed. And what I'm going to show you is really a challenge that Jim Jeffries sent out to the world when he said he was so strong that no living man could pin his arms behind his back. And once Jack Johnson heard this, at every chance he got, he tried to pin the arms of his opponent. And there are different commentators that actually added a voiceover after this talking about that fact. I just need you to be patient with me as I go to the point. And I want you to look very carefully at how, it's just 20 seconds, Johnson tries to grab his arms behind his back, which infuriated not only him, but the audience. You see it now. Then if you saw that, but it's not just the clinch, it's actually him trying to pin his arms behind his back. And then before I return to Jeptha, I'm being very unpredictable, much like a fight. Joe Louis also was a great fan of Jack Johnson, again back to this intellectual heritage between political generations. Offers us even more possibilities of thinking race through boxing as more than a contest of fists. If Jack Johnson's film was banned in South Africa, Joe Louis was less easy to ban, but within the United States of America, and again, I'm seeing so much about the bending of the knee, a lot of questions were asked both then and now about how Joe Louis both united America, but at the same time divided America, because of his famous fight against Adolf Hitler's top fighter, Max Schmeling. And just before the World War II, Hitler starts to create a special breed of fighters through eugenics, through brutal training, that would be world-dominating boxers, the Aryan race. And so when the opportunity to fight Joe Louis, a black American, came, both sides were quite interested in this meeting. And it was on the second meeting that Joe Louis comprehensively destroyed Max Schmeling to such an extent that none of the Nazi party wanted to visit him in hospital after his spine was cracked by Joe Louis. And what happens after the film is that there are two sides. The Americans that suddenly cross racial boundaries to talk about how incredible this all-American Joe Louis was in taking the idea of American excellence to the world. But then again, you still have this ingrained racism of sports writers talking about what a savage he was. And again, to ensure the chemical change in your brain, I want you to watch in slow motion, because of the rich archive we have of this fight, of Joe Louis absolutely destroying Max Schmeling, much to the horror of Nazi Germany. PG warning. So they're going to play it in slow motion very soon. I just want you to take 2 minutes to watch that. So you see the 15 strikes that he endured in slow motion after this. That's when his spine was cracked. And that's the killer punch, as it were. And what, again, is incredible about spending time with the words that describe the boxing, you find these ingrained, racist attitudes. And this is from Michael Moore, who was a sports writer of the day. The slow motion picture of the 124 seconds of the Joe Louis Max Schmeling fight is probably the most faithful record ever made of human savagery. The background noise and excitement prevented anyone from getting a cold and objective view. I was appalled by the knowledge that this ruthless, unmerciful killer there on the screen was the one and the same man who had left just a few minutes before, the Joe Louis who spoke of ice cream and trips to Europe and his new pinstripe suit. So it's the idea that instead of looking at a sporting victory, the heroic, the glorious is reduced to savagery, and the idea that, a lot of black athletes who are on hair triggers, that they could flip in 1 second, and the very athletic prowess that was for the benefit of the country could be used against it, which was, of course, the latent theme Michael Moore was appealing to. What's also very important, again, to counteract the savagery of boxing, is the idea of care that I'm returning to now, but this in the writing of Nelson Mandela. And one of the greatest privileges of my life was also publishing in Transition magazine on Mandela the boxer. And what is very important for Mandela to verbalize in The Long Walk to Freedom, which was his biography, was that the gym was a space for his young son. And we can read that through a number of frames, through a heritage frame, a masculinity frame. And again, to honor Mandela's own words, this is the extract from his book. The gym not only kept me physically fit and busy during my spare time, but was an enjoyable form of relaxation and took my mind away from the more serious problems of race relations that harassed us at the time. The next morning, I would wake up feeling fresh, strong enough to carry about my body with ease, and ready to begin the new day and face up to all the trials to which life exposes me as a black man in my country. And what that really builds on is the idea that boxing was a certain bolstering, a support, despite the racial violence that a lot of South Africans experienced on a daily basis. And here Mandela actually names it. He says, our club members were very much the product of township life. They carried all the scars oppression inflicts on our people by driving our people into the gutter. But the outstanding feature was that each of them, he's talking about the comrades in gym, in his own way, showed remarkable qualities which survived despite these conditions. So here you see this idea of boxing not to get a shot at the title, but to remain human, savagery, the violence between men, but this to facilitate a certain protection against the derangement that apartheid does psychologically. We also see this heritage of Mandela, which starts in Jeptha's time, in the District 6 Museum, where so many parents want their children to take up boxing. And my contestation in my monograph is that it's not really about developing professional fighters, but it's the idea, which is a very ancient notion, of gladiators, Stoic philosophers, of care of the self. As Jeptha says, to take care and to take pains with yourself, with the Stoic principles, which seem very simple but are actually very complicated the more you think about it. Be concerned with yourself. Know yourself. Practice yourself. Take care of yourself, which in some ways was the tetrapharmacos for the derangement of apartheid. And the same image there, you see the boy growing to a man with alternative concepts beyond racial derangement. Not a black man, a white man, a so-called colored man, but this incredible ontological transcendence that happens when you reach a certain level of being a boxer and you are given a boxing name. And you heard in America things like Sugar Ray or coffee color cooler or black chocolate. In South Africa, it was very different, strangely. In a nation that put race right up front in its policies, we have much more subtle names. And what I'm suggesting is that the giving of this name to a young man who had proven himself through discipline, through fighting, was a way to transcend a certain kind of crisis of identity that the apartheid government enforced. So this is an example of homicide Hank, right? So he wasn't the macchiato murderer, you know, or the coffee killer. He was homicide Hank. And here you've got Kid Sweetie, again, at the height of the apartheid era, who wasn't described by racial terms, which allowed the giving of his name. And of course, we can link this to, you know, Caliban and the Tempest and choosing your own name. In boxing, it was about being given a name. And this power that this enacted, this kind of reward, and what it meant for expanding conceptions of the self. What's also interesting in the same archive that we find Andrew Jeptha's text in is the apartheid government's mistaken idea that by segregating suburbs, by putting black people in one suburb, white people in another suburb, and so-called colored people in another suburb, that these people wouldn't mix. And here we see Jake Tooley being welcomed in District 6 by the so-called colored community because of his incredible ability to box. Race that didn't even feature. So we have so many black people going into different spaces, and the reverse also, to kind of sit and understand the gladiators that they were so proud of. And what is so touching for me is to see this image from the District 6 Museum, where Jake Tooley, and again I'm thanking Tina and Chris for their help, is that here you see a visible public affirmation that welcomes Jake Tooley as a son into what was then seen as an exclusively colored neighborhood. And what happens almost 80 years later is that this practice becomes formalized, actually, when we see Marco Cianfanelli's sculpture, Shadow Boxer, being put in a public square that previously was racially segregated and celebrated, but again, not simply Nelson Mandela as a heavyweight, who actually didn't have a heavyweight record to speak of, but what boxing does for Nelson Mandela's leadership, his thought. The extracts that I've just read now help you to think that idea through. From my own very personal space, again, with my own qualifications as both an artist and a PhD in history, I really like the ideas of art as making ideas in public and putting ideas in the public in a way that so many of these carefully guarded texts that you know, are not put in the public. And in my own kind of thinking, and it's something we're going to get maybe feedback from in Jenny's colloquium tomorrow, is that I think about history as being, art as being desire and history as being power, in the sense that there is a disciplinary logic about what is right and what is wrong in history. But I always think of artists who visit the past as having desires. And as Stuart Hall said so famously, which I'll talk about again, is that desire must play with power to produce knowledge at the limit. And I had two exhibitions that were both creative, but that dealt directly with Andrew Jeptha and some of his fighting comrades. The first was in 2014, which was called Night Fighter, which was talking about his blindness. And then Boxing Ghosts, that included Andrew Jeptha. and a number of his contemporaries. What was also interesting that Nikki pointed out in the introduction, a generous introduction of me, is that it also used augmented reality. In other words, it allowed people with smartphones to point their phone at an image and call up documents from the archive that hadn't been seen for 50 or 60 years. And this is the space where there are two tablets in the middle, and all of these boxing antiques on the wall. But pointing your camera at these objects, you'd see images emerge and video clips emerge of boxes. The other side of the exhibition space, I actually installed a fully functional gym, and the local club trained there, so that you had this idea of people being able to look at the exhibition, but also looking at gladiators in training, as it were. And here's an example of Andrew Jeptha looking at an object with a smart device and seeing a poster pop up. And the handles that you see were specially designed so that if you wanted to engage with a smart device, you had to take a fighting pose. And what was so nice is that if you spent enough time in the exhibition, your arms ended up being quite fatigued, much like fighting in a boxing match. At the start of the match, the exhibition, I also invited the middleweight champions to give a sparring demonstration, and there was a hushed silence when you heard the boxing glove hit the pad, because I think what happens in academia is that the world of ideas is so incredible, but in the Greco-Roman times, ideas and physical cultures were actually the same thing. Night Fighter was quite proud of this exhibition. I developed a special boxing mask that had the eye slits sewn shut, which alluded to Jeptha's blindness, and the boxing mask was period correct. There was also this beautiful sculpture. I'm saying it's beautiful. It's not that you need to agree with it, but it also looked at how when a certain light hit the hands, you saw what looked like an X-ray of the bones beneath the flesh, and some of them were distorted and broken, much like a boxer's hands. I want to talk very briefly now, before I'll head towards the end of my colloquium talk, about the work at Harvard. And as I said, the book is very early in its ideation, and there's no publisher or anything, but I'm very interested in the idea of what Jeptha offers thinking racial identity, but even in the idea of white writing that challenges what little history we have of black fighters. And what I mean by this is that a lot of my information comes from apartheid era writers who have a very clear love for boxing. But what I discover is that so many of these apartheid era sports writers write about black subjects as if they're on the brink of dying in every formulation, what I call the dying gladiator trope. There's no possibility about thinking about these boxes as inspirational or full of desire. And I think that's part of the syndrome that I call the homo economicus syndrome. In other words, they only look at these men in relation to their economic prosperity, in relation to the poverty they grew up in and the poverty they die in, which in my estimation is a form of subjection that I'm going to challenge in my book. And if you don't believe me, I've got, to match Jeptha's writing, I've got 3 paragraphs from one of these writers that talks about Andrew Jeptha. So this is the white writer writing. Andrew Jeptha, the young colored boxer from the slums of Cape Town, fights his way to the top ranks when he defeats British welterweight champion Curly Watson. But Jeptha's story is destined for tragedy. He is soon forced into a punishingly demanding schedule of fights which tire his body and damage his eyes. He will eventually return to the Cape, where poverty-stricken and blind he will die. There's no mention of Abby Mitchell. There's no mention of his children. Also, this idea of the black boxer being dependent after his moment of glory. This is again from the sports writer. The passage of time has all but obliterated the achievements of Andrew Jeptha. Jeptha's fame was brief, and he was to spend most of his life in blindness, which is not correct, dependent on the charity and goodwill of the few who remember the greatness that was his. And then finally, without any complicated reading of Jeptha's biography, the South African boxer in Britain, he offers this summative full stop. He spent the last years of his life sitting on the pavement where the flower sellers had their stalls in the bottom end of Adderley Street, staring with sightless eyes at those who bothered to pay a shilling for the thin booklet he offered for sale. Memories are all he had left, and these he had to sell to live. And so what I'm proposing in the beautiful formulation of a German poet is, come, let us talk. Who talks is not dead. Jeptha understands that his words will be read beyond his life, as is indeed the case today. And in my monograph, and again it's early stages, I suggest that Andrew Jeptha shows how a black and blind subject gathers himself from his limitations, but this to seize the course of his own identity through text, through his own writing. Jeptha shows how the interplay of boxing, care of the self, sophisticated self-writing, and crucially self-loving and loving across color lines may be constitutive of how it is we overcome the psychic and the social nightmare of racial formation so desperately needed in South Africa. And the irony here, of course, is that Jeptha's blindness produced this text. In other words, the conditions that I argue help us to actually see. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Kurt. It's funny, the question I had you answered in the last slide, which was how do you reconcile the visuality of the boxer in terms of his representation in photographs, but also showing these films where you get a sense that much of the spectacle is the ability to see this over and over again.
Absolutely.
If you have access to it. And so you answered this question for me about how do we take the visuality of Jeptha, who then, once he's blind, turning the visuality of himself into text. So with that answered, what role do you see violence playing in reconciling these different aspects of boxing and the acceptance of black boxers in particular in the realm of the public eye? Because there seems to be something about this idea of watching this fight with Joe Louis, for example, and I wonder whether there are any films of Jeptha at all. It doesn't sound like there's anything.
There's one
dealer
who proposes that he has one, but it is yet to be authenticated.
Yeah. How do you in your monograph reconcile the sort of spectacle of violence in the care of self in relation to the black body?
So again, I think the roots of what I'm suggesting go back to sort of ancient Greco-Roman culture, and there was something very powerful called the gladiator's oath that was part of slaves becoming gladiators. And in that oath, I think it goes something like, I agree to be bound, to be burned, and to die by the sword. And once they took that oath, there was an incredible invisible operation that happened. They moved from the status of being a slave to the status of being a gladiator, even if they never fought publicly in the arena. And it's that internal work that I'm suggesting is something we're missing in boxing, right? That ontological transcendence, the commitment to a set of principles, of discipline, of psychological exercises that allow you to get to a level of physical or mental fortitude that can fight, as I said, against the deranging politics of the world at large, but also that the spectacle of boxing is also something that, to a large extent, you can decide upon. So there was a lot of boxers that trained to a certain level and would spar, but would never actually become professional boxers. And so what I'm saying is that boxing is very productive because I'm asking us to focus on the invisible operations that boxing enables.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
Yes.
I was wondering if there were any film strips of that period showing Nelson Mandela fighting.
To be honest with you, I haven't looked at the filmic archive of Nelson Mandela. I'm really drawn to the images of him, the carefully posed images, I might add. But also Nelson Mandela, in terms of my research, wasn't really a contender. Boxing again for him was something, as I read in terms of his book, that was about a certain kind of mindset, a certain kind of discipline, a certain kind of brotherhood in the gym. As far as I know, you know, he was never a contender. He was never someone that got the license, went to the circuit, and fought so that you could have a shot. You know, by all accounts, he was a failed fighter, failed heavyweight, you know.
Thank you.
Kurt, thank you so much for this talk. What an amazing figure. So also in relation to part of what Nikki was asking in terms of, I feel there's like a need for reconciliation, you know, in many contexts, especially in terms of the many paradoxes that seem to be at play. At the same time that you have this incredible regime for the caring of the self and physicality as the muscular dreams that you talk about. That seems to be the space of the gym. The gym is where you have care of the self, and the ring is where you get destroyed. You know, in the sense that, you know, you care for yourself only to be better destroyed in the ring, or you know, in that sense. And in terms of Jeptha and how he was able to write, how his ability to then turn his life into a narrative. I mean, part of what you said is how one of the damaging narratives of white commentators is about this, how they turn it into money, or what was the Latin term, homo economicus?
Yeah.
And so, and part of what he was doing was to, of course, try to care for his family and turn his life's into a text that would make money. But in part of the excerpts that you're reading, it also seems to be a kind of guide or a self-help book in a way but the audience seemed to be young men. I don't know if the way the excerpts you read, it sounded like he was speaking to young men, and I was wondering if he was speaking to young black men, and specifically, and whether or not he was trying to enact a care of the self that would, I mean, is he himself a sacrifice? Like, is he the collateral scar that he talks about to this regime of boxing? Or is there another kind of more redeeming factor that he's trying to create in this text as a legacy that will not only have this directionality of ultimate destruction, but rather to turn back to the positive aspects of the caring of the self in this way? Or is it always just this, you know, entropic destruction?
Wow, JC, that's in the number of punches you've thrown. And I think there's actually a number of questions you've asked there. So I'm going to answer the ones which I think I've heard. I think, Jeff, to answer the question that's foremost on my mind, he's certainly not directing his texts at black young men. And I know this because, again, he had such a rich life. At some stage, he's a coach to an Olympic boxer who's white. So he gets approached by a wealthy man whose son is interested in boxing, and you know, he coaches the son for the Olympic boxing games. And so I think Andrew Jeptha talks about bodies encountering each other, right, in the ring. And in the moment of heightened competition, race is not present. Right? He never talks about hit a white man like this and hit a black man like that. And I think it's something, you know, incredibly puzzling to Jeptha. He calls himself a colored man, you know, after many years of being abroad for the first time, right? Because he hears that term, the term gets racialized and et cetera. And I also think that you know, Jeptha doesn't offer all the answers in his text. But I think what he talks about, and I think they do come through in the passages that I've read, is that it's actually not about kind of an apocalyptic drive, right? He actually talks about the life-giving power of boxing, right? Boxing as a way to move in the world. And I think the consequence of being trained as a boxer, as I said, doesn't naturally lead to fighting in a professional way, right? So I think in some ways, to have the finitude of being in a boxing ring as a possibility validates many of, I suppose, the more poetic and the ephemeral way that he writes. It's similar to the possibility of, and I'm going to sound, you know, the perils of masculinity. It's like having a gun, but not necessarily needing to use it. Also, I think in terms of your other question, I think the book is riddled with paradoxes, right? So, and I think we must also, as scholars, be careful so that we can see through things that masquerade as a light read, you know, when in fact they're offering us so much richness. Because, I mean, Andrew Jeptha's text is really filed under sporting memories, you know, which And in my kind of estimation, it really, as a literary scholar, I hope you will agree, you know, it talks about that incredible poesis of the text, you know, how text itself is written by a boxer in such a way where the text is not a boundary, you know, where words and flesh depart, but it's a space where they can actually come together.
Kurt, I'd like to echo Jean-Christophe's praise of what was a tremendous talk. I'm very struck by the time at which Jeptha is writing this. And it reminded me a bit of Thomas Mafolo, and he drafts Shaka, I think, the same year that Jeptha wins his title. And what was so clear about Mafolo were there's so many challenges for him in order to be able to have his text published, because it had to be written in a certain way and contain certain themes in order for it to pass that quote-unquote standard of publication. So I was hoping you might speak a little bit more about Jeptha's text, and were there a lot of obstacles to getting it published? Did it have to appear in a certain way? How did that process unfold?
Okay, so thankfully it's relatively easy to answer in the sense that it's also one of the first self-published books, right? And again, it's this question about the racial boundaries. What happens is that so many white British men, once they discover that Andrew Jeptha is blind, he can no longer hide it, they rally around him, right? And they raise the princely sum of 87 pounds, right? So that he can take this and start a confectionery or a tobacconist shop in Cape Town. And after that fails, right? He speaks to his backers to say, the only thing I've got left is to self-publish this book, right? So in actual fact, there was no boundaries necessarily available to Jeptha that had to be traversed. It was a financial boundary, because what happened was he would sit on the side of the street, essentially, and sell these booklets. And the location of the flower sellers are also very important for the circulation of the text, because that was the point where international visitors would come to buy proteas, which is the national flower of South Africa, and to be in the high street. So Jeptha is at that nexus of internationalism and South African kind of curio shops, and he kind of puts himself forward in that way. And what's also powerful is that the APO, the African People's Organization, which at that stage was seen as the leading colored party before the ANC, takes Jeptha into their newsletter and asks him for a number of copies which they can then circulate in Kimberley. And they appeal to their readers to please help a South African, and they insert colored boxer in Britain to help the circulation so that it gets purchased by their constituency. But also, this is the power of field work, which I think is not really a big feature in South African academia, in the humanities, unlike it is with the American Academy, where field work is so important. In my own limited field work that I did, I discovered that within Jeptha's booklet, there are a number of commercial products that are advertised, like ointment, beer, etc. And when I went to the spot where he sat, I actually noticed that all these businessmen, historically, if you take the early map of Cape Town, were less than 200 meters from where he sat. So there's also the idea that the book was a pamphlet, right? So that if you saw the ointment or you saw the beer, it was within walking distance of the business itself. So I think that was a clever way that Jeptha used to literally do point-of-sale marketing, if you will, so that the business owner would win, but at the same time, they could print a number of copies for him. It was kind of like a win-win.
Go ahead.
Okay, sorry. It's an excellent talk, and I applaud you for approaching a subject which would be very challenging in an academic, lead academic context. The question I have, as I was listening to your talk, I was trying to compare the aesthetic sense. There's an aesthetic, style, culture associated with boxing, and on the issue of violence, boxing actually functioned in many working class neighborhoods as the alternative to lethal violence. So I'm coming up as a kid, and we all pooled our money and bought boxing gloves. And we would box all night in our neighborhood because we were too poor to have air conditioning. So wasn't nobody going to bed in Philadelphia with 90-degree weather at midnight. So boxing had a stylistic, an aesthetic, swing, rhythm, music thing, which had a function in certain contexts of keeping a whole bunch of young black males alive because boxing was the preferred art form over lethal violence. And so is there a parallel context? Sugar Ray Robinson, there are a whole series of R&B, blues songs that revolve around, or the sort of the equivalent of Jackie Robinson's song, which was Life is a Ball Game. There was a song that came out when Jackie Robinson surfaced as a baseball player. And and Miles Davis, the boxer, big fan of Sugar Ray Robinson. So was there a comparable aesthetic, style, cool thing that evolved in the context of the South African boxing, which is very pervasive in the context of black culture, popular culture in the United States?
Sure. As they say, killer punch. If I'm brutally honest with you, again, I can only respond in terms of the research that I've done. And in my view, it's actually that kind of combination of living in the world in a certain way that's linked to boxing and the productive aspects of what boxing means to your personhood was actually something that South Africans drew on wholeheartedly. So I wonder if it's a very, I won't say it's a specific thing, but boxing was very different in Europe, right? There is absolutely an American boxing visage that I think South Africans in some ways worshipped. You know, again, I spoke about Nelson Mandela citing numerous occasions what it meant for him to understand the boxer Joe Louis as a child, what it meant to listen to his fights. And again, it's also that idea of the American black man, you know, where African meets America, two radically different but yet comparable kind of points. And that's why I'm saying it's such a beautiful moment that I sometimes dream about. You know, Andrew Jeptha meeting Jack Johnson, right, in London at the point where they're both married to, you know, racially transgressive women. And what's so powerful about what you're saying is that I think you're saying it's also, and I agree with you, it's about taking boxing more seriously, not less seriously, right? Saying that boxing doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's not a silence, but I agree with you that it permeates culture. And I think that a lot that I'm writing about in the monograph, again, sees the boxer not as somebody who was powerful at letting blood or, you know, violence between two men. But what I'm saying is that in the most radical way, boxing is an intellectual bond between political generations. And that's why it's so fascinating. And I think I also mentioned that at the start of the talk, that if you're serious about boxing, for me, it's so incredible. You almost never start in this present moment, but you start with the greats, right? Because it's such an intimate one-on-one relationship to be a boxing champion. Very different from saying who was the greatest football player or soccer player, because they always exist in a team. Boxing is a lonely path that produces the visage of the gladiator. So I think that there's a very special way that South Africa wholeheartedly drew on American boxers. As I said, the greatest bureaucratic, institutional, national gift, according to my reading of state policy, was the Clinton administration's move, you know, to get all living boxers that Mandela admired, including some that were passed and presented to him, that in no other way produced tears in Nelson Mandela. And I think that says it all to me, you know.
Kurt, thank you for this fantastic presentation. I have this short question on his legacy, actually. Yeah, as you said, yeah, he was redacted as a poor man, just speedily died by the apartheid press or writings. But what's his post-apartheid legacy? I mean, how the South Africa public currently depicted him. I mean, we know that Mandela is just a figure, not only in South Africa, but everywhere. He was a political figure. I have this problem that such professionals like Andrew Jeptha are forgotten by many. I mean, even if they contribute something, but I mean, it's a global problem. I feel that. What's the South Africa's public's view currently about his legacy?
You see, again, I would say that many scholars in South Africa are in some ways fascinated with the archive because for so long it was a space they couldn't trust, the selective archiving, right? And I think after the democratic elections, I think there was a whole generation of scholars who actually revisited what they understood as subaltern black heroes that were actually suppressed, you know, in the past. And again, it also ties in with the rewriting of the curriculum for primary school and junior school kids, where for the first time they were introduced to the first black stars in politics, in science. You know, it's after 1994 we see a radical mindset where it seemed to me as if all the disciplines recalibrated and started to look for black subaltern figures that actually were not comfortably lodged in the archive. And what I can say now, and again, I would never claim that it's because of my research but in 2010, suddenly we see Andrew Jeptha appear in the South African Sports Hall of Fame, which is just a few years ago. It's not even that long ago. And the commitment of the South African Sports Hall of Fame is then to continue to revisit the past. And they're finding incredible stories about top black golfers, you know, weightlifters that were never given a shot, that couldn't go to the Olympics. So I think it's a very exciting time to look at the idea of subaltern subjects that made themselves distinctive in their sporting environment. But I think the silences are actually deafening. And I think that's the challenge of scholars that are interested in this manner of work.
I just wanted to thank you for a superb paper, though. I just learned so much. I salute you. I wanted to build on what Brother Eugene was talking about in terms of the ways in which boxing generates exemplary figures. I think part of your conceptual framework is the weight of exemplarity and what impact various examples can have on oppressed peoples. I remember spending time with Prince. Prince had a picture of Jack Johnson. In his room, he loved Jack Johnson. He thought Jack Johnson was the freest black man other than himself. Oh, you remember in the letters between Albert Murray and Ralph Ellison, they spend many pages on Jack Johnson. Miles Davis made an album called Jack Johnson. We can go on and on and on. What is it at the level of example? It has something to do with masculine bonding, and has something to do, and the violence is still real. I mean, it's a barbaric sport. Let's just be honest about that. Even if the barbarism was more intense on the ground and lethal violence, just beating each other up and killing metaphorically is not spiritually fulfilling in a very moral sense. We got honest, but so patriarchy is still operating in the background. But also, there's something called honor in a context of fairness. In a white supremacist society, the only space where fairness exists is in the ring, and that depends on the referee. Every other space black people have is a structure of unfreedom. So to be in a space where there's fairness and then you've beaten a white person up means that black humanity, black respect, black sense of being able to triumph when they're treated fairly is reinforced. That's part of what black self-respect and black self-determination is. So I would think that within not just the U.S. context, but in the South African context, just at that level of fairness, but then there's that spiritual connection.
Absolutely.
That's what Prince loved about Jack Johnson. Right. And it wasn't a white sister, because Prince wasn't crazy about that. Yeah. He just allowed, he tolerated that. You see what I mean? What he saw was a Jack Johnson who was free enough to be himself, and he happened to have a vanilla sister. Right. But he ain't big on the vanilla sister. That's not the point. It's the freedom to do what you want to do, and then to do it in a transgressive way. Whoever you end up, black, white, red, could have fell in love with another brother. I mean, that's another issue we won't get into right now. But all I'm saying is, all these different levels you got working, and I salute you, though, brother.
Professor West, thank you for that. And I just want to quickly respond in terms of your very intriguing kind of marrying of Prince with Jack Johnson. And again, I'm very sure that I'm butchering Wiener Dass's quote, right? But I'm going to be very bold here. And Wiener Dass, the scholar of subaltern studies, right? The people that we can see that are below the rank of what is normally captured in the archive. She says, whenever you see this kind of rupture of individuals, and sometimes even of rebellions that start, that are very emotive, but then somehow disappear, or in the Boxer's case, recede into poverty or the annals of time, She says, what it offers you is a nighttime of love, not a lifetime of love. And the sexy idea of a lover that we cherish, even though he visited us once, is what she likens certain subaltern figures to. And I would argue that people like Jack Johnson, Andrew Jeptha, offer that kind of very emotive idea of putting desire back on the table. That the work of desire is not necessarily to sustain a 30-year relationship, but provides the conditions for a rupture. And I think that's what we see in Jack Johnson and Andrew Jeptha.
Thank you, Kurt. I'm not sure if it's on. Yeah, okay. Thanks, Kurt. That was really fabulous, so intriguing. Quick comment and then a question. I was reminded when you were talking about the text as like a way to convey kind of upright standing and care of the self of our tour of the Black Heritage Trail. And when Frederick Douglass, at the end when we went to the museum, Frederick Douglass was using the medium of photography as a way to portray Black citizens, Black people as upright. Yeah. And you know, I think he only smiled in one photo in his lifetime, was because he didn't want to, he went against the time of portraying Black people as happy and such like that. So a very interesting kind of correlation. My question is concerning the relationship between exemplary figures, as we see in Jeptha, and the common ordinary person. And so, I mean, if you could talk a little bit more about the context of apartheid, and so you were showing pictures of kind of this movement between, you know, Black boxers were invited to certain events, and then white boxers were also like heralded in Black neighborhoods, and so you do see this kind of crossover. But at the same time, I was wondering, like, if they made exceptions for these figures, for these exemplary Black boxers, or if this were the case of kind of paving a path forward for other ordinary citizens. Because I was thinking about this also, this notion of spectatorship, and it almost seems like the ring is kind of like the boundary, and those within the ring, like, that's an okay, kind of the spectacle is okay, but outside, it's the acceptance is not, it doesn't transfer over. And I was wondering if you could talk about these issues. Thanks so much.
Again, a very complicated set of provocations in your question. And again, I'm going to respond to those that I hear clearly in my own kind of mind. The first thing about the ring as a boundary, the spectacle, I think in terms of apartheid South Africa, what again not a lot of people know, there were at least 3 occasions when Black African-American boxers were actually shipped into South Africa to fight white South African champions, right? And sometimes the match couldn't take place in South Africa, so it would take place on the borders, right? Because the government wouldn't allow it, but it was filled with South African citizens. And again, it certainly was this desire to, in some ways, to see the spectacle, right? But that spectacle as the competition between 2 bodies. You know, it's almost like a layman's biology, right? Is it true about what they say in terms of what the animal instinct of Black men versus the intelligence of the white boxer? And yet, what is not recorded again in the shadow of the apartheid archive is somebody like Mike Weaver that was brought in to fight Gerrie Coetzee and was so soundly beaten, I think in the 3rd or the 4th round, that commentators talk about a hushed silence, right? And what that alludes to is that although the ring was a spectacle, it wasn't always a dialogical thing, right? So it died in the ring. People went home with their thoughts because there were no Black people allowed to watch the match. And at every stage, I think, there is this idea about sport speaking for more than its own kind of ends, right? But also the idea that the future of masculinity had to be changed, right? Because it couldn't be based on muscularity, right? That is a lesson that the South African government had to learn. And what again comes to the fore is the idea of the symbolic power, right? Of Black bodies, you know, competing and beating white bodies. And yet that wasn't always the relationship between boxers. And the example, to go back to the American example, Joe Louis beat Max Schmeling so soundly, as I said, that he was actually disowned from the German elite. But many years down the line, because of that very intimate bond, Professor West was talking about a certain brotherhood, a certain masculinity. He used to give Joe Louis money, because at that stage he was the first person to bring Coca-Cola into Germany. And because of the bond that they experienced, it's a bond that I suppose you can only really understand once you've encountered it. They were friends for the rest of their lives. And not just friends, but intimate friends. So again, even though the spectacle of boxing talks about violence, talks about a very clear kind of poles, the reality of one body experiencing another in the heat of competition produces a certain bond in the right conditions that I think, in a very strange paradox, produces friendships. You know, it's about respect, it's about honor, but with a different set of different terms for the debate.
Thank you very much.
Okay.